Well, our main news this morning, and the Prime Minister's calling for robust pragmatism as he lays out his foreign policy agenda in a speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet in London later on today. It's one of those phrases you sort of know what he's getting at, but what does it actually mean?
Well, citing the threats of Russia and China, he will say the UK needs to plan for the long term and stress the importance of a strong domestic economy at home to tackle competitors abroad. Now, all this coming amid this unprecedented wave of protests in China against the country's COVID policies. Demonstrators in Beijing last night called for the resignation of the Premier Xi Jinping. Well, let's speak now to the assistant editor of The Spectator, Cindy Yu. Good morning to you, Cindy, and thank you so much for joining us. So if people are watching and listening now, this has actually been going on in China for a long time now, this zero COVID policy, been going on for years, and we've seen protests start to build up in the last couple of weeks, haven't we? Just give us the context of what we're seeing there at the moment.
Yeah, it's actually really over the last few days that protests have been happening. So obviously it's a massive country. First of all, there are always localized kind of attempts to break out when local officials and the residents kind of clash. But what we're seeing at the moment over the weekend is nationwide protests with a political message. It's not just about zero COVID anymore. Some of them, as you mentioned in your introduction, are calling for Xi Jinping to step down. And they have found those slogans, they have found the words to say that through a protest that happened just before the National Party Congress opened last month, where this lone man in Beijing standing on a road bridge, I don't know if your viewers remember, unfurled this kind of 24 characters banner calling for Xi Jinping to step down. And those slogans have kind of, been revived by the latest round of protests. And for these people, zero COVID has just gone too far, and it says something to them about the nature of the politics in the country as well.
Interesting with all of this is how it then ties in with what we're hearing from Rishi Sunak, because there are concerns about what China's doing with zero COVID policy. There are concerns about human rights and Uyghurs in China, the way all that is handled. And yet what we're hearing, or going to hear from Rishi Sunak today, is robust pragmatism, which means what exactly in relation to a country like China? Having some firm words but wanting to keep the economic channels open?
Yeah, I think that is what it means. Well, look, Stephen, if I were in Number 10 over the weekend, I would have told them not to kind of announce this today, wait for the dust to settle on these protests a bit more and see what's going to happen, because it's not beyond the Chinese Communist Party's power to crack down violently and harshly. And this puts the UK government in a bit of an odd position. So I would have probably delayed this speech for another week or so, or at least use slightly different wording, because pragmatism doesn't sound amazing. I can understand what he's saying, and I think I do agree with that, which is that you're never going to, eradicate China. You're never going to be able to cause regime change if that was your goal coming in, because that's incredibly hard. And often you don't know what comes after that. So given that, you kind of have to live and work with the current situation in China. And I think in some cases, communication and dialogue is actually more effective for policy change than kind of grandstanding and shunning them and ostracizing them. So I can see where Rishi Sunak is coming from. But from a kind of PR perspective, it's not brilliant timing. Although I am heartened to see that this is the approach that we're going to take, because the more dictatorial that Xi Jinping becomes, the more he'll need Western interlocutors to kind of tell him what's going on. Otherwise, he'll get into a bit of an echo chamber like we've seen with Putin.
But aren't we... You get the sense... I know we haven't got the full speech yet from what he's going to say tonight, but you get the sense that, he's outlining a foreign policy agenda which is actually very insular. It's about, keeping trade open. It's about having a strong economy here in Britain. So it's foreign policy, but inward-looking.
Well, I think if by inward-looking you mean serving British interests first and foremost, that's kind of what I want my foreign policy to be. Because, obviously, I guess the alternative is to promote democracy across the world, interfere with other countries, even if, that means, war, invasion, or whatever it is. I think, putting British interests first is probably the best way forward. I'm not sure I would call that insular looking.
Do you think this could be a watershed moment in China, the biggest protest since Tiananmen Square, which 1989, I believe it was? How big and how significant is what we're seeing right now?
So I think we will have to see how it happens because, as I've mentioned, the nationwide protests have only been happening for over the weekend. Tiananmen Square was a sit-in in the most major square in Beijing for weeks on end. So we're not at that scale just yet. If they continue, they could get there. But then you even look at the way that Tiananmen Square was tackled down. So I don't know. I have to say I'm naturally very skeptical and cynical of the idea of regime change, policy change, unless the Chinese Communist Party really wants it. Of course, they're going to find scapegoats, so local officials will be the first to be blamed, and that might lead them to some improvements in the zero COVID policy just to be a bit more humane. And if the protests keep up their pressure, the party may decide that Xi Jinping is not the right person for all of this, but for various reasons, institutional and factional, Xi is kind of in a very safe position at the moment.
He was meant to be a reformer, wasn't he? When he took power, he was seen by the West, at least, as someone who would be a very gentle reformer, at least. Now he seems to have almost established himself as virtually a new age emperor in all of this. It does seem a remarkable situation that we find ourselves in with China.
Yeah, I think that just goes to show how opaque Chinese politics is, because I guess an analogy would be Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, where people thought he would be a reformer for letting women drive. So I think with these kind of authoritarian states, it's always hard to know what's happening behind the scenes. The reasons that people thought Xi Jinping would be a reformer excuse me, is because his father was a reformer. His father promoted a lot of economically liberal policies when he was a Communist Party official. Xi Jinping himself was around quite a lot of the economically liberal regions and provinces in China. But at the same time, when you are governing a whole country, we never really properly knew what Xi himself believed in. So it was always really kind of reading the tea leaves, hoping he'll be a reformer. And I'm sure there'll be a bit of wishful thinking in there as well. And then when faced with the task of governing the whole country, clearly his own personal views have come up. But I think it's important to say that China has been on this downward trajectory since before Xi Jinping was in place. So there's a strain of thought that says actually the structural environment here means that anyone in his position has to do kind of similar things. I'm not sure I fully buy that because I feel like there's small things that you could do differently, zero COVID, for example. But yeah, so we still don't really know what Xi Jinping himself believes in. He's so opaque.